friends, in the series which we are doing on issues in world history, the 20th century, today we will talk about the rise of fascism and Nazism. As we are aware that how fascism and Nazism, they are seen to be the counter-revolutionary movements in response to the Russian Revolution which took place in 1917. And thereafter we see that how both these movements, fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany, both of them resulted in the rise of two dictatorial leaders at that point of time, Mussolini and Hitler, and how both of them they participated in various kinds of wars which were there, the kind of policies which they followed at that point of time. They were also being criticized by many of the Marxists of that particular period and thereafter. So, we find that this kind of rule which we see in Italy, especially beginning from 1922 onwards, when Mussolini came to power as the prime minister, when he was being invited by the king, and thereafter we see that the kind of policies which he followed and how Italy was dissatisfied during that particular period despite being on the victor's side in the First World War. And Italy felt that it was not being treated fairly in the First World War when Treaty of Versailles was signed, and many of the areas which Italy wanted, they were not being given to it. And in that sense we find that there was some kind of a disappointment in Italy, and how Mussolini used that kind of a disappointment to his own advantage, and he was able to in a way establish, or in a way able to consolidate his power in Italy. In the similar vein, when we see Hitler, we find that how Hitler was also able to utilize the emotions of the masses of those of that time, those who were living in Germany, and he felt that how Germany was being treated unfairly in the First World War. Many of the areas of Germany, they were being taken away. The kind of reparations which Germany had to pay to the victorious nations, they were astronomical in number. In that sense, the kind of amount which was being demanded was huge, and we find that there was a lot of disappointment in Germany the way Germany was being treated after the First World War. And Hitler was able to seize power from 1933 onwards, and he was able to mobilize the masses in that sense, and the kind of terror in that sense which was there in the concentration camps, for which we have a number of evidences as well. That has also been discussed by the historians, and even we find that how many a times many historians, they have also argued that Hitler was responsible for the Second World War, the kind of policies which he followed. So, when we talk about the rise of Nazism and fascism in both these countries, we find that the First World War definitely played an important role. The kind of policies which were being followed by the victorious nations after the First World War led to such kind of a situation in both these nations. One was on the victor's side, another was on the side of the nations who were defeated in that sense. And we realize that this situation resulted in the rise of Nazism and fascism in both these countries. And we also find that from the ideological point of view, they had a lot of similarities, and how during the interwar period we find that Nazism and fascism, they were seen to be the harbinger of the Second World War. And when you talk about both the leaders, Mussolini and Hitler, both of them, they had their own dissimilarities as well, but at the same time the kind of policies which they were following, they had some similarities as well. And when you talk about fascism, we find that how it was being taken from the Italian word fascio, which meant bundle, and figuratively a bundle of rods, and an X, a symbol for the party flag as well. So, when you talk about the Italians, how this idea of fascisti, it suggested the national unity and strength as well. And we find that how Benito Mussolini had formed his fascist party in 1919. And when you talk about Germany, we find that how Nazi was a term which was associated with the members of the National Socialist German Workers' Party of Adolf Hitler, which was the Nazi party. And Nazi was a word which was being used for a person who was fanatically dedicated to or sought to seek control over some activity or practice. So, this idea of fascism and Nazism, it had a lot of adherents, it had a lot of supporters, and how these supporters they were supporting Mussolini as well as Hitler in both Italy and Germany. And we see that the kind of mobilization of the masses, both these movements, they were able to garner a lot of support from the masses, and we see that this kind of a support to both these leaders, they were able to mobilize the opinion in favor of them. And when we talk about the situation of Italy during that time, we find that it was not satisfied politically, and it was also shattered from the economic point of view. And we find that when you talk about Italy of that particular period, then post-war neurasthenia or fatigue could be seen in Italy, and it in a way could fall easy prey to an aggressive and ambitious political program which was being launched by Mussolini. And if we see the background of this kind of a situation, we find that during the First World War, when Italy was part of the victorious nations, and it had a lot of hopes and ambitions that how after the war we find that some kind of a respite for the poor peasants and the workers it will come. And we see that this could not be achieved after the First World War, and because of which we realize that this situation resulted in some kind of a political dissatisfaction from the Italian point of view, and how it was being utilized by Mussolini to forward his program of a fascist state. And he was also successful in that sense, in the sense of how people they in a way received the kind of ideas which were being propagated by him, and they were also receptive to these kinds of ideas. And we find that during the war how Italy's illusions, grand illusions which were being there in Italy, they resulted in some kind of a disappointment. And if you see the practical situation of Italy at that point of time, then poverty and unemployment, both of them they were there. And when Italy was not able to seek the kind of desire it had in terms of the Treaty of Versailles, because Treaty of Versailles was seen to be as a kind of a treaty which did not provide much to the Italians, and because of which we find that Italy was dissatisfied with this kind of a situation. And with the kind of a mobilization of Mussolini for this particular cause, where we find that he was able to mobilize the emotions of the people, those who were dissatisfied in the First World War. And we also see that how Germany, when it got defeated in the First World War, and it had witnessed important developments at the Treaty of Versailles, as I have told you earlier. And we also find that the rivalry, age-old rivalry which was there between the France and Germany, it also continued during this time, and how the German areas or French areas which were taken by Germany in the war earlier in 1870-81 in the Franco-Prussian war, like the Alsace-Lorraine mines, they were being taken away from Germany now after the First World War. And apart from this, we also see how Russia emerged as the first communist state in 1917 and thereafter, and the economic depression of the 1930s, especially beginning from 1929 onwards, we find that it also created a kind of a situation which was not economically suitable to Europe and America and other nations at that time. Though the economic depression started in USA, but we find that its reverberations or its economic impact could be seen across the world, and how European nations, they were dependent on American funds at that point of time, so they were also largely affected. So, we find that this kind of a situation where there was a lot of unemployment and poverty in 1920s, in especially in Italy and Germany, and especially Germany, when you talk about this, and how there was a lot of devaluation of the currency in Germany, and how Hitler was able to in a way utilize that kind of a situation to its own advantage. And so, we find that this kind of a situation was directly or indirectly responsible for the rise of fascism and Nazism in both these countries. And we also see that how both these ideologies in that sense, or fascism for that matter, they were also responsible for the commencement of the Second World War in 1939. And we find that how both Mussolini as well as Hitler, they supported, they were aggressive in nature, they in a way wanted to secure more and more areas for themselves, and how they occupied some of the areas which were lying in other regions or nations. And apart from that, we also see that in the Spanish Civil War, how they supported General Franco, who was also dictatorial in nature. So, their support to such kind of regimes which were dictatorial in nature, and their in a way commitment to their own ideology or ideas, where they wanted to secure those regions for themselves which were not lying in their own countries, also resulted in a kind of a situation which led to the Second World War. And when you see the background in that sense, we found that how Italy was situated in the southern part of Europe. Italy's geographical position is one of the strongest determinants of its external policies, and its mainland is a narrow peninsula, and the distance from the sea coast is not more than 75 miles. So, in that sense, Italy's geographical position was an important determinant in that sense. And we also have seen that because of its geographical position, it has also been seen as the prisoner of the Mediterranean as well. And how its external policies, they were also guided by its geographical position, as we have seen. And we also realize that apart from its geographical position, the kind of political dispensation which was in a way there at that point of time, especially Benito Mussolini, who assumed power, and how his policies in a way guided the kind of a situation at that point of time. And we also see apart from that, in the case of Germany at that point of time, how Nazis and Hitler, both of them, how Nazis, which were being in a way they mobilized by Hitler in that sense, how NSDAP, which was the party which was supported by Hitler, and how Hitler became the most important leader of Nazi Germany. So, in that sense, we find that both these movements, which are seen to be the counter-revolutionary movements, and how Italy's situation from the geographical point of view, how it could easily be subjected to the blockade from the sea. And we also see that if Mediterranean was controlled by an enemy, Italy had no choice but to go to war. So, how we see that Italy had this kind of an ambition to become a Mediterranean power and establish its supremacy to safeguard its commercial and maritime interests. So, this kind of pride and aspiration, which was a motivating factor for the strong nationalist fervor among the Italians, and Mussolini was intelligent enough to comprehend this kind of a nationalist feeling, and he capitalized on the same to capture the power and institute dictatorial Italy. And we find that how he was able to use the kind of a situation which was existing at that point of time, and how his policies and ideas, they reshaped the kind of policies which were being followed in Italy at that point of time. And we also see, when you talk about Italy, when you talk about Mussolini, we find that the economic distress or the hardships, they facilitated the rise of the socialists and revolutionaries in Italy before the arrival of Mussolini, and the workers and the agricultural laborers were often on the streets of the countryside protesting against the misdoings of the state, and how the factory owners and the landlords, they were being forced to grant higher wages and shorter work hours for the workers. This was also happening. So there was some kind of a fear of some kind of a communist uprising, and at the international level we find that the Communist International Comintern, it inspired the Italian Socialist Party, and it got affiliated to the same as well. So in that context we find that there was a fear among the capitalist section of the Italian society that if the Communist Party in Italy is successful, then it may come to a situation that they are controlling the state. So it became easier for Mussolini to in a way utilize those capitalist forces as well, because he was in a kind of a situation where we find that he turned himself into some sort of a person who was against the communist ideology. Though he was a socialist earlier, but the kind of change in his stance over a period of time also in a way helped him to in a way get the support of the capitalist section and the other sections of the society. And when you talk about the kind of socialist parties which were there in Italy at that point of time, and how the Italian Socialist Party, it also gave a call for the dictatorship of the proletariat in Italy. And we find that how this party in a way contested the elections and secured the 1/3 votes in November 1919, and it emerged as the single largest party in the Chamber of Deputies, or the lower house. So this also created a condition where the capitalist sections of the Italian society, they felt threatened that if this kind of a situation will continue, then their wealth might be at stake. So we find that this kind of a situation immediately after the war also created conditions for the rise of fascism. And when you see the other kind of a situation, we find that how the Catholic peasants, they were inspired by the religious orthodoxy. They seized the land of the landlords in the central and the southern Italy, and the socialist workers, they seized and controlled the factories of the northern Italian cities in September 1920. Apart from this, we also see that the liberal government of Prime Minister Francesco Nitti in 1919-20, and then of Giovanni Giolitti, a five-time Prime Minister during 1892 and 1921, and he became helpless and refrained from taking any action for the fear of an upsurge of violent revolution. So this kind of a political situation, it existed in Italy, and the various prime ministers from different times, especially 1919 and thereafter, as I told you about Francesco Nitti and Giovanni Giolitti, and they were also not able to take any kind of an action, and they were also fearful of some kind of a violent revolution. And when you see the situation, we find that the socialists, they also witnessed some kind of a split with the consequent decline, and the revolutionary socialists, they formed a separate communist party in January 1921. And this kind of a socialist upsurge alarmed the landlords and the industrialists, those who were fearful of these kinds of factions, those who were after their wealth. And in this situation, they realized that if they have to in a way safeguard their wealth, if they have to safeguard their money, they have to support someone who is against the communist elements. And all these people, they found some kind of a refuge in the nationalist movement and the patriotic movement, which was in a way rising under the leadership of Mussolini. And we find that how the nationalists, they promised to restore the lost prestige and the respect for the Italians among the Committee of Nations, because there was a feeling that how the Italian prestige had been lost after the war, when Italy was not being treated in a fair manner by the victorious nations, and the kind of rightful respect the Italy should have among the nations, that should be in a way restored to the Italians. And when you see this kind of a background, we find that how fascism emerged in Italy under Mussolini. And when you see the background of Mussolini, who was born in 1883 from to a family of blacksmith with the socialist leaning, and how he became the creator, soul and the guide of this movement and the fascist party as well. And initially, as I told you earlier as well, he was a socialist agitator, and he was exiled to Switzerland, and in 1912 he opposed the Italian aggressiveness, was against Turkey, and was captivated, and he in a way agitated for Italian participation on the side of the Allies when the First World War started in 1914. And we find that how he was in a way made to leave the country, or rather sorry, he was made to leave the Socialist Party on the account of supporting the war. And we find that he also participated in the war by joining the army, and he also got wounded in 1917. So we find that Mussolini was a supporter of the war when he joined the army, though initially he did not support the war as he was a socialist, but thereafter we see that his support to the war and how he was in a way thrown out of the party. And over a period of time, we realize that he saw the kind of demerits which were there in the Russian Revolution, and he was against the Russian communism. He became some sort of an enemy of communism, and he was there to fight against the communism throughout his entire life. And when you see it in the background of the conditions and the circumstances that existed in Italy during and in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, and how they were conducive to the rise of fascist dictatorship under Mussolini. So as we have already discussed, that how kind of a distaste of Mussolini for the communist movement and communist Russia as well, and the kind of situation which was prevailing in Italy at that point of time, it led to this kind of a situation where we find that he was able to garner a lot of support from the masses. And we see that how he established the first FASI, or the Club of Patriots and Intellectuals, in March 1919, and started the fascist movement in Italy. And he in a way also became some sort of a rallying center for the unemployed youth and ex-soldiers who were there. And for this he was supported by the industrialists as well as the landlords of those times, those who were fearful of any kind of a communist or socialist revolution. And we find that on behalf of these people he was ready to fight against the socialist. And we also see that how the army officers, they provided the arms and ammunitions to Mussolini, with which his followers broke the meetings of the political opponents, and how the followers and the workers of the party, they were enthused with some kind of a discipline, how they had to follow the ideas which were being propagated by Mussolini. And his volunteers, they were known as black shirts for their attire, and were to salute their deuce, or the leader, with their hands stretched in the old Roman fashion. So he was able to create this kind of a discipline among the black shirts, and how these people, they were ready to sacrifice themselves for the party as well. So we will continue with the ideas of fascism and the role of Mussolini and Hitler in the rise of fascism and Nazism in our next lecture. Thank you very much.